As an author, what made you want to write the last letters of Jesus?
Well, unfortunately, that's quite a hard question to answer, and I'm not really one that I can answer quickly. The story began when I was a small boy growing up in the UK, and I found Christianity and the Lord's Prayer in particular morally and philosophically offensive, if I'm honest. The line that said, and lead us not into temptation, I found repugnant. The idea of a God that, unless begged to do otherwise, unless we made ourselves right with God, would abandon us to evil and to actively lead us into temptation. I couldn't live with that. That was a deal breaker for me. So I abandoned Christianity, or the idea of God, for most of my life. I happened to read about 11 or 12 years ago, I happened to read the Lord's Prayer in Spanish. And in Spanish, that line reads, no nos dejes caer en tentación y líbranos del mal, which means do not let us fall into temptation. And that was an entirely different philosophical paradigm. Obviously in the Spanish version, God is someone that will protect us and stop us from falling, whereas in the English version, he's someone that is a monster. So I started to have a look at what's going on here, what was actually correct. This is obviously, one is the antithesis of the other. They can't both be right. So I started looking at the original text and started looking at the Codex Sinaiticus Vaticanus. What was the original, the closest to the original that we had? And as it turned out, that the translation in the Greek is aispheros, and the active preposition is I. So in the colloquial Greek of the time, the implication would have been, do not let me yield to temptation, which means that the Spanish Bible, it was much closer to the original translation. Then I started to look at if I got this wrong and the church lacked the moral vision to ask that question, then what else did they get wrong? As it turned out, the translations in the Bible, in the New Testament, and the translations from the original Hebrew in the Torah and the Tanakh are pretty much dreadful. And whoever wrote the Gospels obviously didn't really know Palestine very well, the mistakes in geography, understanding of Jewish culture. So I started a search for the historical Jesus, and fully intended to write a scholarly work on the relationship between modern Lurianic Kabbalah and the earliest followers of Jesus after his death to about 55 AD. Because as it turns out, there is a very, very strong philosophical parallel between those two. But then very quickly I realised, as I sat down to actually write the book, that nobody had read it. Also, you can't really grasp the concepts of Lurianic Kabbalah unless you actually live. If you have to live it. So I hit upon the idea of writing a historical fiction, The Last Letters of Jesus, the Secret of the Nazarenes. And I wanted to give the reader a chance to live within the skin and the bones of these people, to understand the times, to understand the political, socio-political context, and to live this philosophy in order to get a feel for the words that we believe the original historical person may well have said. Also, I wanted to have a look at what could have happened in reality that may have formed the basis of the legends that were built up around the historical character over the next 500 years. So that's pretty much how I came to write the book. It was an accident.
Jesus in your book is called Yeshua, and there is no mention that he sees himself as God. Your book is listed as historical fiction. Is the book a fantasy or based on solid research?
Well, very quickly, the answer to that, the name thing is pretty easy. The name Jesus doesn't exist in Hebrew or Aramaic. Jesus is just an approximation of the original Hebrew name, which was Yesu. So from that point of view, the name Yeshua is solidly based on history. And then that question that you've just asked presupposes that what we're really saying is how far do you deviate from the gospel stories. So you really have to realise that when you read the gospels horizontally, you very, very quickly realise when we read them linearly, one after the other, you kind of think, oh yeah, but there's some synchronicity there. I read that story before. But when you look at them horizontally, you realise that they just don't line up. When they come to mention something as monumental as a resurrection of a human being, it's not the kind of thing you'd fudge. It's not the kind of thing people mess up on. Then you realise that Mark was written first, and the last 12 verses of that were added. The Mark's story actually ended with an empty tomb. Also, the Gospels totally stuff up Palestinian geography. They totally misunderstand the actual paradox, the actual dichotomy between Israel and Judea, that are actually two countries, not one. So what I tried to do with the last letters of Jesus, the Secret of the Nazarenes, was to put Jesus back into his historical context, to actually bring back to life the original idea of how much division there was in Jewish thought, how much division the northern, the Israelis, the northern kingdom of Israel, felt that the Judeans had forged the Torah. There was a resistance against the cult of animal sacrifice, which puts the story of Jesus and what was actually going on why he may have said the things that he said, it puts it solidly back into Jewish history and the history of the country. So in my opinion, the story of the last letters is much more based on reality than the gospel stories. Although I didn't really try to rewrite history. I tried to create situations that may have given rise to the legends that we eventually inherited. I hope that answers that one.
In your book, the main antagonist is the Judean high priest. Would you say your book is anti-Semitic?
Well, the most important thing as a takeaway from the book, The Last Letters of Jesus, so I tried to, as I just said, bring to life the socio-political realities of the time. And the Israelis, the Esseni movement, which later became the Nazarene movement, believed that the Judeans had forged the Torah. There is internal contextual evidence within the Old Testament, within the Torah and the Tanakh, that the ordinary people resisted the cult, the Judean cult of the elites, and kept reverting to the worship of El, which of course the name Israel comes from the idea that El was the original god of the Jewish people, rather than Yahweh, which was brought in by the Judeans much later. Rather than being a Roman versus or a Gentile versus Jewish story, the Last Letters of Jesus is very much just a Jewish story. So it's Jews against Jews rather than Gentiles against Jews. So the character of the high priest is seen in the book through the eyes of the Israelis, seen through the eyes of Jesus, of Yeshua, and his friends and followers.
How do we know that Jesus even existed?
That's a question that I often get asked, and it's an accusation that I think anybody that's interested in this subject is often hit with. And to be honest, without being rude, the question is really based on an ignorance of historical methodology. My grandfather, as an example, lived in Sri Lanka, Ceylon. The country doesn't even exist anymore. I have very, very little evidence or proof I could give to you to prove that my grandfather lived, but obviously he did. As it turns out, the historical evidence that we have for the historical character is overwhelming. The problem that you have when you start talking about did Jesus exist, was which Jesus are you talking about? Are you talking about the mythical Christ, which was a figment of Paul's imagination? The miracle worker, born of a virgin, died for our sins. That was very much a creation of the Romans and the Greeks much later on. That wasn't what the original Jewish followers believed, and that wasn't the person who was the brother of James the Just. It wasn't the person that was mentioned by Josephus. A quick answer to that is there is no evidence for the life of the Christ, but there is overwhelming historical evidence for a historical Jew who lived at that period and gave rise to the sayings which are held within the Synoptic Gospels like a flying amber.
The Last Letters of Jesus deals with the life and death of the historical Jesus, but as this is the first book in a trilogy, what comes next?
The death of your hero is obviously a bit of a problem for a trilogy. but the second book deals with a much more fun character, Paul. If you actually read the letters of Paul and actually manage to dig through his serpentine logic, the character of Paul is much more interesting, and it's Paul who is actually the father of Christianity. So that's a lot of fun, and I'm in the middle of writing that at the moment. And he goes. We have it in Acts that he goes to Cyprus and meets the son of Jesus, Yehuda. So we pick up Yehuda, who's kind of just mentioned in the last letters of Jesus, but the third in the book, in the series, the third in the trilogy, is focused on Yehuda, the son of Jesus, and his experiences in Cyprus with his mother, and their interaction with Paul. So basically, the first book is dealing with looking at the world through the eyes of Yeshua. The second in the book is looking through the eyes of Paul, and the third returns to the Jewish point of view and the followers of Yeshua through the eyes of his son Yehuda. So hopefully it'll make a holistic whole by the time we get to the end.